Leroy Devereaux adjusted his robe and took a deep breath, looking at his reflection in the judge's room mirror. The wrinkles around his eyes had become more noticeable over the past year. 46 years old was not an age when you could afford constant tension, but there was no choice. Austin, despite its reputation as a progressive oasis in Texas, was still a place where an African-American judge's career hung in the balance, especially if that judge covered up something that was considered unacceptable in conservative circles. He ran his palm through his short-cropped, graying hair. His mother always said he had a noble appearance, high forehead, shrewd eyes, well-defined lips. "You'll go far, son. Just keep your mouth shut and follow the rules." Her words had haunted him all his life, and he had followed the rules. At least in public. The wall clock read 9:30 in the morning. In 15 minutes, the regular session would begin. An ordinary fraud case. He had hundreds of them to his credit. He repeated the details mechanically to himself. Defendant Quentin Brooks, 30 years old, accused of a series of minor credit card scams. Nothing outstanding. Leaving the room, Leroy headed toward the courtroom with his usual measured gait. The corridors of the Austin County Courthouse were filled with the usual morning bustle. Lawyers with piles of papers, nervous witnesses, police officers escorting defendants. No one paid much attention to him. Judge Devereaux was part of the system, one cog in the well-oiled machinery of justice. "Good morning, Your Honor," the clerk greeted him, handing him a folder with today's case file. "Good morning, Jerome," Leroy replied, accepting the documents. "Anything out of the ordinary?" "Nothing unusual, sir. Just the usual fraud. The prosecutor is determined, but the evidence, frankly, is not good." Leroy nodded and entered the courtroom. The usual ritual. Everyone stands, he takes his seat, announces the start of the session. All business as usual until his gaze met the eyes of the defendant. Quentin Brooks was standing next to his state-appointed attorney, a young but battered man with hard features and a wary gaze. Something in his eyes made Leroy inwardly tense. Recognition? Impossible. He had always been wary. "The trial of Quentin Brooks is now open," Leroy said, taking his eyes off the defendant. The trial went on as usual. The prosecutor made his case, listing the episodes of fraud, the use of counterfeit credit cards, the defrauding of the elderly, the small but numerous scams. Brooks's attorney languidly objected, citing insufficient evidence and a lack of direct witnesses. All the while, Leroy could feel the defendant's scrutinizing gaze on him. When it came time to question Brooks himself, Leroy finally realized why he felt uneasy. The defendant's tone of voice, his demeanor, all seemed vaguely familiar. "Minus Mr. Brooks, do you plead guilty?" the prosecutor asked. "No, sir," replied Quentin, but he looked directly at the judge. "I think I'm being confused with someone else. It happens, doesn't it? People lead double lives and may not be recognized where they would prefer to remain anonymous." Leroy felt a chill run down his spine. A memory suddenly surfaced in his mind. The Moon Shadow Underground Club 3 weeks ago. The semi-dark room, the muted music, and that man at the bar watching him. Leroy hadn't thought much of it at the time. Stares were commonplace in places like this. "Minus Mr. Brooks, answer the prosecutor's question on the merits," Leroy said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I apologize, Your Honor." Quentin smiled. "Sometimes I get distracted by details, especially when I see something or someone interesting." The rest of the meeting passed like a blur. Leroy listened to the arguments, adjourned for a decision, and retired to his office. Closing the door, he leaned against it and closed his eyes. This couldn't be happening for real. He was always careful, always chose places away from the city center, never used his real name. Back in the hall after the recess, Leroy announced the postponement of the final decision until tomorrow, citing the need to study the case file more thoroughly. This was unusual for such a simple case, but no one objected. When the hearing was over, and Brooks was being led back to the holding cell, he turned and spoke loud enough for Leroy to hear. "I hope to see you tomorrow, Your Honor. I have something to say. To you personally." For the rest of the day, Leroy couldn't concentrate. He canceled 2 meetings, citing a migraine, and went home early. His modest home in suburban Austin was his fortress, a place where no one could intrude on his privacy. He turned on the TV but didn't watch it. immersed in thoughts of the possible consequences. The phone rang at 9 o'clock at night. The number was undetermined. "Judge Devereaux speaking," he answered in an official tone. "Good evening, Your Honor." Quentin Brooks's voice was calm, almost friendly. "I hope I'm not distracting you from important business? How did you get my number?" Leroy felt his heart begin to beat faster. "I have my methods, Judge, just as you have your, hobbies. The Moon Shadow is an interesting place, isn't it? Especially on Thursdays." Leroy squeezed the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. "What do you want?" "Oh, just justice, Your Honor. Tomorrow you'll have to admit insufficient evidence and release me. That's not so hard, is it? Especially since the evidence is really weak." "That's blackmail," Leroy hissed. "I prefer the term mutual aid. You help me, I keep your little secret. Everybody's happy. And if I refuse?" Quentin laughed. "You're a smart man, Judge Devereaux. Think about what would happen if certain photos got into the hands of the press, or, worse, your colleagues. An African-American judge from conservative Texas turns out to be a regular at a gay club. It's going to be a huge scandal." Leroy closed his eyes. Everything he'd achieved, years of study, decades of an impeccable career, it could all come crashing down overnight. "I'll think about it," was all he could say. "Excellent choice, Your Honor. See you tomorrow." The connection went dead, leaving Leroy alone with his thoughts. He poured himself a whiskey, a habit he had tried unsuccessfully to break, and sank into a chair. The options were few and all equally unpleasant. He could give in to the blackmail and make an acquittal. It was against all his principles, but it could give him time to find a solution. He could have refused and accepted the consequences. The end of his career, public censure, the collapse of his entire life, or he could... No, he didn't even want to think about that. The phone rang again. This time the number was familiar. Darnell Patrice, owner of Moon Shadow and the only person with whom Leroy had a more or less permanent relationship. "Leroy? Are you all right?" Darnell's voice sounded concerned. "Not really," Leroy replied. "I'm in trouble." He briefly explained the situation, omitting details about Quentin's specific demands. "That bastard!" Darnell hissed. "I know him. He showed up at the club a couple months ago. I thought he was just looking for some fun, but apparently he had other plans. What do I do?" Leroy felt helpless for the first time in years. "Come to my place," Darnell said. "We'll work something out." Leroy hesitated. Going to Darnell's place late at night could be another risk, but being alone with these thoughts was unbearable. "All right, I'll be there in an hour." He changed into unremarkable clothes, jeans and a dark shirt, and walked out the back door to the garage. His unremarkable gray sedan was the perfect transportation for a man who didn't want to attract attention. Darnell lived in a small apartment above his club on the east side of town. It wasn't the most upscale neighborhood, but it had started to change for the better in recent years, with new art galleries and hipster cafes. Leroy parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the way, constantly looking around. Paranoia? Maybe. But in his position, caution wasn't unreasonable. Darnell was waiting for him at the service entrance. A 42-year-old man with an athletic build and a short beard hugged him, then quickly escorted him upstairs to his apartment. "You look lousy," Darnell said, pouring him tea. He didn't drink alcohol himself, and he didn't approve of Leroy's fondness for whiskey. "I feel worse," Leroy replied, sinking down on the sofa. "My whole life hangs in the balance. This Brooks, he's dangerous. Not just to you." Darnell sat down next to him. "He has a reputation for squeezing every last drop out of people. If you give in now, it's only the beginning." Leroy nodded. He understood that himself. "But what am I supposed to do? I have no choice." "There's always a choice." Darnell's eyes sparkled. "I can talk to him. I have my own methods of persuasion." "No," Leroy said firmly. "No violence. I don't want to drag you into this." "You already dragged me into it when you called," Darnell objected softly. "We're in this shit together." They talked into the night, considering various options. None seemed ideal. In the end, Leroy decided to buy time, to make a formal decision tomorrow to continue the investigation and try to find some dirt on Brooks. "Stay the night," Darnell suggested as the clock struck 3 in the morning. "I can't," Leroy shook his head. "I need to be home in case someone is looking for me." They said their goodbyes, and Leroy walked back to his car. The city was asleep, the streets were deserted. He felt like the only awake person in the world, carrying the weight of his secrets through the quiet night. The next morning, Leroy awoke with a headache and a heavy feeling of foreboding. He mechanically performed his morning ritual, shower, shave, breakfast, and headed to court. Today he was to make a choice that could change his entire life. But when he arrived at the courthouse, he was greeted by an unusual commotion. Police officers scurried back and forth, and several detectives stood in the hallway. "What's going on?" Leroy asked his clerk. "Terrible news, Your Honor," he replied. "The defendant, Quentin Brooks, was found dead in his cell this morning." Leroy felt the ground slipping from under his feet. "Dead? How?" "Details are unknown, sir. The police are conducting an investigation. The meeting is canceled, of course." Leroy nodded and headed for his office. Closing the door, he sank into a chair, trying to make sense of what he had heard. Quentin Brooks was dead. The threat was gone. He should have felt relieved, but instead a strange numbness swept over him. Detective Siobhan Temple stared into the pale face of the dead man lying on the metal morgue table. Quentin Brooks looked calm, almost peaceful, as if he had simply fallen asleep. No signs of struggle or obvious trauma. Just small dots on his neck that would have been easy to miss on a cursory examination. "Poison," said medical examiner Corinne Gill, standing nearby. "Preliminary tests show something synthetic, possibly from a group of neurotoxins. Full results will be back in 48 hours. Siobhan nodded, making notes in her notebook. 38 years on the Austin Police Department had taught her that details decided everything. She was a short woman with short dreadlocks tucked under a severe cap and shrewd eyes that rarely escaped her. "How could he have gotten the poison in the holding cell?" she asked. "It's my job to say what he died of, not how it happened," Corinne shrugged. "But if you're interested in my opinion, it's a professional job, quick and clean." Siobhan looked at the body again. Quentin Brooks, 30 years old, a small-time crook with no distinguishing features. Nothing in his file indicated any ties to serious criminals. Then why would someone choose to eliminate him in such an elaborate way? "Anything else?" Siobhan asked. "Yes, something interesting." Corinne walked over to the computer and displayed an enlarged image on the screen. "There's a mark on her right wrist. Looks like a burn from a rope or something. Pretty fresh, I'd say a day or two before death." "Was he tied up?" "Could be. Or it could be the result of some sort of, intimate activity." Siobhan raised an eyebrow. "Quentin was not married, and as far as I know, not in a relationship," she said. "That's not necessary," Corinne smiled. "Especially not these days." Leaving the morgue, Siobhan headed for the station. A plan of action was already forming in her mind. The first order of business was to interview Brooks's cellmates and the guards, then study the surveillance tapes. Someone had somehow passed the poison to the prisoner, and she was going to find out who and how. Waiting for her at the station was her partner, a young detective named Lorenzo Ray. He was sitting at his computer, reviewing surveillance footage. "Anything interesting?" Siobhan asked, dropping into the chair next to him. "Nothing obvious," Lorenzo shook his head. The food was centralized, and Brooks had no visitors. The only contact he had with the outside world was his lawyer, who'd come by last night, and the guard serving dinner. "A lawyer?" Siobhan frowned. "Why would he come in the evening after the meeting?" According to him, Brooks wanted to discuss defense strategy. They'd been talking for about 20 minutes. "Check him out. The lawyer's name is Raymond Ellis," Lorenzo answered. "Already checked him out. Clean as a baby's tear. He's been a public defender for 5 years. No complaints." Siobhan tapped her pen thoughtfully on her notebook. "What about Brooks's family? Is there anyone you can talk to?" "Parents are deceased. There's a sister, Lakeisha Moses. Lives on the east side of town, works as a nurse at a community clinic." "Great." Siobhan stood up. "Let's go see her. Maybe her brother told her something about his problems." Lakeisha Moses lived in a modest apartment on the second floor of an old building on East 12th Street. It was a working-class neighborhood populated mostly by African Americans and Latinos. Many of the houses were in need of repair, but everywhere there was a sense of care. Pots of flowers on the porch, Neatly trimmed bushes, freshly painted doors. Lakeisha opened the door after the second knock. She was a tall, slender woman with tired eyes and hair gathered in a tight bundle. She was wearing house clothes and slippers. Detectives Temple and Ray, Austin PD. Siobhan introduced herself, showing her badge. Can we come in? It's about your brother. What did Quentin do this time? Lakeisha asked, letting them inside. You don't know? Siobhan exchanged glances with her partner. Know what? Lakeisha's voice was troubled. Minus Ms. Moses, I'm sorry, but your brother is dead. He was found this morning in the holding cell. Lakeisha froze, her eyes widening. Then she slowly sank down onto the couch. How? Was all she could manage to say. We're investigating it, Siobhan replied. Preliminary results indicate poisoning. Poisoning? Lakeisha shook her head. That's impossible. Quentin never took drugs. He was careful with alcohol. Even his medications were prescription only. We believe it was not accidental, Siobhan said softly. Minus Ms. Moses, did you notice anything unusual about your brother's behavior lately? Did he seem worried or mention any problems? Lakeisha was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. He came to see me a week ago, she finally said. He was very agitated, said he'd stumbled onto something big that could change his life. I thought he was up to some kind of scam again, so I didn't ask. Did he say what it was about? No, but... Lakeisha hesitated. He mentioned someone important, said he had leverage now. Siobhan leaned forward. You don't remember who exactly he was referring to? No, he didn't name names, but it was someone in the government or the judicial system. Quentin said something like, now this big shot's gonna dance to my tune. Siobhan and Lorenzo looked at each other. This could be an important lead. What else can you tell us about your brother? Did he have any enemies? Maybe he owed someone a debt? Lakeisha shrugged. Quentin was always good at making enemies, but no one serious enough to... She couldn't finish the sentence. He'd been going to some new club a lot lately. Moonshadow, something there. Moonshadow? Lorenzo asked. Yeah, that's right. Said he could meet interesting people there. I thought he meant potential victims of his scams, but maybe there was something else there. After talking to Lakeisha, the detectives decided to check out the judge who was handling Brooks's case. It was standard procedure to interview anyone who had contact with the victim in the last few days. Judge Leroy Devereaux received them in his office. He looked collected and calm, though Siobhan, with her experience, noticed signs of tension, a back too straight, words too carefully chosen. This is shocking news, the judge said after they had informed him of the purpose of the visit. Death in a remand cell is a serious matter. When was the last time you saw Quentin Brooks? Siobhan asked. At yesterday's hearing. It was a pretty standard case. Credit card fraud. I've postponed sentencing until today, so I can get a better look at the file. Did you notice anything unusual about the defendant's behavior? The judge was subtly tense. No, nothing in particular. He behaved like most defendants. Nervous, a little defiant. And outside the courtroom? Lorenzo suddenly asked. Had you ever met him under any other circumstances? Siobhan cast a quick glance at her partner. This question had not been prearranged. No, of course not, the judge answered firmly. I never meet defendants outside of court. It would be a breach of ethics. Of course, Siobhan nodded. Just a routine matter. We're interviewing everyone who had contact with the victim. As she left the judge's chambers, Siobhan tugged on her partner's sleeve. What was that? Intuition, Lorenzo shrugged. Didn't you notice how he tensed up at the mention of the out-of-court meeting? Something's not right. Maybe, Siobhan agreed. But we need facts, not conjecture. For now, let's check out this club, Moonshadow. If Brooks really found some dirt on the big shot, it could be there. Moonshadow was located on the east side of the city, in a neighborhood that had once been considered dysfunctional, but had become trendy in recent years among hipsters and creative intellectuals. From the outside, the club looked unremarkable. A brick building with no identifying marks, just a neon sign with a crescent moon above the door. It was still early. The club wasn't open, but the detectives noticed lights in the second-floor windows. They knocked on the door, and a minute later it was opened by a tall, athletic man with a short beard. We're closed until 8 o'clock tonight, he said. Austin Police Department. Siobhan showed her badge. "We'd like to speak to the owner." "It's me." The man stepped aside to let them inside. "Darnell Patrice, what can I do for you?" Inside, the club was much more spacious than it looked from the outside. A dark wood bar, a small stage for speeches, soft couches and chairs arranged in groups to create cozy areas. "We're investigating the death of Quentin Brooks," Siobhan said. "We're told he was a frequent visitor to your establishment." Darnell squinted his eyes. "Quentin's dead? What happened?" "He was found poisoned in the holding cell this morning." "Damn." Darnell shook his head. "Can't say I'm surprised. This guy knew how to make enemies." "So you knew him?" Lorenzo asked. "He came here a few times in the last couple months. I can't say we were friends, but people talk to the bartender a lot at the bar, and I sometimes fill in for my guys." "What was he talking about?" Siobhan watched Darnell's reaction carefully. "The usual stuff about work, money problems, nothing special." "Did he mention anyone in particular? Maybe talked about someone he'd met here?" Darnell thought for a moment. "No, I don't recall, although—" he paused. "He did say something about a judge a couple weeks ago. Didn't give a name, just said he'd met an important person in a robe here and it might be useful." "And you didn't ask what he meant by that?" Siobhan raised an eyebrow incredulously. "Look, detective, my club is a place where people can be themselves without judgment. I stay out of their business if they're not causing trouble." Darnell crossed his arms over his chest. "And by the way, Moonshadow is a gay club. We try to be discreet. Many of our visitors prefer not to advertise their orientation." Siobhan and Lorenzo glanced over at each other. This information added an interesting new twist to the case. "Minus Mr. Patrice, do you have any CCTV footage?" Lorenzo asked. "We'd like to see who Brooks was socializing with in your establishment." "We don't have cameras inside." Darnell shook his head. "Again, for privacy reasons. There's only one at the entrance, for security. Then we'll need the footage from that camera for the last month," Siobhan said. "And a list of all the employees who worked the days Brooks came in." "You'll need a warrant for that." Darnell straightened. "I respect police work, but my clients need protection." "We'll get one," Siobhan nodded. "But you could save us time and just cooperate." "I'm sorry, but my client's privacy is what my business is built on." Siobhan looked at Darnell carefully. Something in his demeanor made her think he wasn't just protecting his visitors. He was hiding something. "Okay, we'll be back with a warrant," she said. "In the meantime, could you answer one more question? Do you know Judge Leroy Devereaux?" Darnell froze for a moment, but quickly regained his composure. "The name sounds familiar. I think I read about him in the papers." "He's never been to your club?" "Like I said, detective, I don't remember all the customers." As she left the club, Siobhan stopped on the sidewalk. "He's lying," she said confidently. "Definitely," Lorenzo agreed. "The question is, about what exactly?" "I think our big shot is Judge Devereaux." Siobhan lowered her voice, though no one was around. "Brooks might have seen him at the gay club and decided to use that information to blackmail him. That would explain why Devereaux was so tense during our conversation." Lorenzo nodded. "But from blackmail to murder is a big step. For a man who could lose everything?" Siobhan shook her head. "I've seen people killed for less. We need to check the judge's alibi for last night and get a warrant to see the security footage from this club." When they got back to the station, they got a surprise. The captain called Siobhan into his office. "Close the door," he said as she entered. Siobhan complied, sensing that she was about to hear something important. "You're digging up Judge Devereaux." It was a statement, not a question. "He's being held as a witness in the Brooks case," Siobhan replied cautiously. "I got a call from the DA's office. They're concerned about the direction of your investigation." "I'm sorry to hear that, Captain, but I go where the evidence leads." "Siobhan," the captain sighed. "I've known you for 15 years. You're a good cop, but sometimes you don't see the big picture. Devereaux is a respected judge with an impeccable reputation. He sentences drug dealers and murderers. He has a lot of enemies." "What are you suggesting?" Siobhan's tense. "Just be careful what you accuse him of. Make sure you have hard evidence before making serious accusations against a man of this caliber." Siobhan nodded, but inwardly, she had already decided that she would not back down. If Judge Devereaux was involved in the death of Quentin Brooks, she would find proof no matter who tried to stop her. Back at her desk, she found that Lorenzo had already gotten a preliminary warrant to access the Moon Shadow Club's surveillance footage. "You're not going to believe this," he said, lowering his voice. "I checked Brooks's phone records from prison. The last call last night was to a cell phone number registered to Leroy Devereaux." Bingo. Siobhan felt a rush of adrenaline. "That's our connection." Brooks blackmailed the judge, and he found a way to get rid of him. "Not so fast," Lorenzo cautioned. "We still don't have direct evidence that Devereaux passed the poison. And don't forget our buddy Darnell. He's hiding something too." "You're right," Siobhan agreed. "Let's go back to the club with a warrant and take a look at those tapes. Maybe we'll see something interesting." They set off for Moonshadow again. This time, Darnell couldn't deny them access to the records. He reluctantly led them into a small room behind the bar where the video archives were kept. "Here," he turned on the computer, "recordings from the last month. But I must warn you that the quality is not very good, especially in the evening." Siobhan and Lorenzo began looking through the tapes, concentrating on the evenings his sister said Quentin had visited the club. Darnell sat nearby, tapping his fingers nervously on the table. On the third tape, they saw this: Quentin Brooks entering the club around 11 p.m. And 20 minutes after him, a man very much like Judge Devereaux, though dressed informally. "Stop," Siobhan said. "Zoom in on that shot." Darnell reluctantly complied with the request. The enlarged image showed the judge's face, though not very clearly. "Is that Judge Devereaux?" Siobhan asked, looking directly at Darnell. He was silent, clearly struggling with an internal conflict. "Minus Mr. Patrice," Lorenzo said softly. "If you know anything about Quentin Brooks's death, now is the time to share that information. Harboring it could make you an accessory." Darnell took a deep breath. "Yes, this is Leroy, Judge Devereaux. He's here on occasion. But that doesn't mean he had anything to do with Brooks' death." "Do you know the judge well?" asked Siobhan. Darnell was silent for a moment, then nodded. "We're close. He's very afraid that his orientation will become public. It could ruin his career. And Brooks found out about it and decided to blackmail him," Lorenzo finished for him. "I don't know for sure." Darnell looked genuinely concerned. "Leroy said he was in trouble, that Brooks knew something, but he didn't go into details." "When was the last time you saw Judge Devereaux?" Siobhan asked. "Last night," Darnell answered after a pause. "He came to see me around midnight, was very upset. Said Brooks was blackmailing him and he didn't know what to do." "And what did you advise him to do?" "I told him he should stand up to the blackmailer. That if he gave in once, Brooks wouldn't leave him alone." Siobhan and Lorenzo looked at each other. A picture was beginning to emerge, but there were still questions. "Minus Mr. Patrice, do you have access to rare poisons?" Lorenzo suddenly asked. "What?" Darnell looked genuinely surprised. "No, of course not. I'm a club owner, not an arms dealer." "Just a routine matter," Siobhan reassured him. "We need to rule out all possibilities." They continued going through the records but found nothing else of significance. As they left the club, Siobhan felt that they had made progress in their investigation, but were still far from a complete picture. "What do you think?" Lorenzo asked as they got into the car. "I think we have motive and opportunity," Siobhan replied. "Judge Devereaux had a reason for wanting Brooks dead. He had phone contact with him the evening before his death. But we have no direct evidence that he passed the poison." "What about Patrice? He looks suspicious too." "I agree. There's something he's not telling us. And if he and Devereaux are as close as he implies, he's also got motive to protect the judge's reputation." "So are we going to arrest the judge?" Siobhan shook her head. "Not yet, no. Let's talk to Brooks's lawyer again. He was the last person to see him alive besides the guard. And we'll run the tox results as soon as they're in. We need to know what the poison was and how it was administered." And then we confront Judge Devereaux and Darnell Patrice. I want to see their reaction when they're in the same room with us." Lorenzo smiled. "I like that plan." They headed back to the station, feeling that the investigation had reached a new level. Now they had to tie all the loose threads together and find the real killer of Quentin Brooks. Detective Siobhan Temple sat at her desk, spread out before her the photos, documents, and notes on the Quentin Brooks case. For 2 days now, she'd been immersed in the details, trying to connect the disparate pieces of the puzzle. The toxicology results had finally come back. The poison was a rare neurotoxin that could only be obtained through certain pharmaceutical channels or on the black market. Anything new? Lorenzo asked, placing a cup of coffee in front of her. Yes, Chauvin nodded. I checked out Darnell Patrice. In addition to the Moonshadow Club, he owns a small pharmaceutical company that specializes in rare chemical compounds for research labs. Really? Lorenzo whistled. That makes a difference. It does. Chauvin tapped her pen on Darnell's picture. He could have had access to the exact type of poison that killed Brooks, but I still don't understand how that poison got to the prisoner. What about the lawyer? Raymond Ellis. I've been through the prison's security footage. He did visit Brooks the night before he died. They talked for about 20 minutes, but there was no transfer of items. Maybe the poison was in something the lawyer brought with him? Lorenzo suggested. In documents, for example? Chauvin thought for a moment. Perhaps. But why would a lawyer kill his client? He had no motive. What if someone hired him? Lorenzo lowered his voice. The judge or Patrice? We need to check their financial records. Chauvin made a note in her notebook. But I have another theory. What if the lawyer didn't know he was passing the poison at all? What if it was just a document, processed in such a way that contact with it could be fatal? Tricky, Lorenzo admitted. Then the lawyer is just an unwitting accomplice. Exactly. And whoever orchestrated this must have had access to the lawyer, his documents, and, of course, the poison. She took a picture of Judge Devereaux and put it next to Darnell's. We know they had a relationship. We know Brooks was blackmailing the judge, and we know Patrice had access to rare chemical compounds, but which one of them actually decided to commit murder? Or did they act together? Lorenzo added. One provided the poison, the other organized the delivery. Chauvin shook her head. I think there's something else here. Something we're not seeing. She turned back to the phone records. Brooks's last call to Judge Devereaux was at 9 o'clock at night. After that, the judge called Darnell Patrice. Then, around 11, attorney Raymond Ellis suddenly received a text from the judge's office asking him to visit his client urgently to discuss a possible plea deal. This is it, Chauvin whispered. The judge had used his position to arrange for the lawyer to meet with Brooks, but the message had come not from the judge's personal cell phone, but from the official number of his office. So he wasn't even hiding? No, he went through official channels, which makes it look totally legitimate, genius and audacious at the same time. Chauvin jumped out of her chair. We need to set up a confrontation. Now get Judge Devereaux and Darnell Patrice down to the station for additional testimony. Tell them we have new information on the case. Are you sure that's a good idea? Lorenzo looked worried. The judge is a powerful man and we still don't have direct evidence. That's why we need a confrontation, Chauvin said firmly. I want to see their reaction when they're in the same room and find out how much we know. Some of them will flinch. 2 hours later, Judge Leroy Devereaux and Darnell Patrice sat in the interrogation room, facing Detectives Temple and Ray. Both looked tense, though the judge did a better job of hiding his anxiety behind a mask of officialdom. Thank you both for coming, Chauvin began. We have new information in the Quentin Brooks murder case, and we hope you can help clarify some of the details. Of course, Detective, Judge Devereaux nodded. Anything I can do. Darnell nodded silently, avoiding looking at Leroy. Excellent. Chauvin opened the file folder. Minus Mr. Patrice, you didn't mention during our previous conversation that, in addition to the Moonshadow Club, you own a pharmaceutical company. Darnell tensed. I didn't think that was relevant. It's a small company that supplies reagents for laboratories. Interestingly, among those reagents is the exact neurotoxin that was found in Quentin Brooks' body. Chauvin watched both men's reactions carefully. Judge Devereaux paled slightly, but kept his composure. Darnell, on the other hand, was visibly nervous. It's a coincidence, he muttered. We keep strict records of all chemicals, especially dangerous ones. Of course. Chauvin smiled. Now, Judge Devereaux, could you explain why you used your position to arrange a meeting between Quentin Brooks and his lawyer the evening before the prisoner's death? Now it's the judge's turn to get nervous. I didn't. It was standard procedure. I was going to offer a plea bargain, and I wanted the attorney to discuss it with the client beforehand. I'm surprised you didn't mention that when we first met, Chauvin remarked, as well as the fact that you regularly attend Mr. Patrice's club and that you have a personal relationship. Leroy and Darnell exchanged quick glances. A tense silence hung in the room. "My personal life has nothing to do with this case," the judge finally said. "I would agree with you if it weren't for the fact that Quentin Brooks blackmailed you by threatening to reveal your orientation," Siobhan parried. "That gives you a very strong motive to want him dead." "That's ridiculous!" The judge tried to keep his composure, but his voice shook. "You have no evidence of blackmail." "Actually, I do," Lorenzo interjected. "A recording of a phone call between you and Brooks the night before he died. The technicians are working on reconstructing the full content now. It was a bluff. They didn't have the recording, just the fact of the call. But the judge's reaction was worth the risk." Leroy Devereaux clenched his fists so white his knuckles turned white. "Yeah, I didn't—" "Enough," Darnell said loudly. "Enough of this farce." Everyone turned to him. Darnell took a deep breath and straightened up. "I killed Quentin Brooks," he said firmly. "Leroy had nothing to do with it. He didn't even know about my plans." "Darnell, no," the judge exclaimed, but Patrice stopped him with a gesture. "It's true, Detective," Darnell continued, looking directly into Siobhan's eyes. "Leroy told me about the blackmail, about Brooks threatening to expose his secret, to ruin his career. I saw how it tormented him, so I decided to take action myself." "Tell me how you did it," Siobhan asked. "I do have access to various chemicals through my company. I took a small amount of neurotoxin and treated the documents the lawyer was supposed to hand over with it. Ellis knew nothing. He was just a pawn. I forged a message from the judge's office requesting an emergency meeting with the prisoner. When Brooks picked up the documents, the poison was absorbed through his skin. It's delayed. Symptoms appear hours later, when they can't be linked to a specific contact." Judge Devereaux sat with his hands over his face. "Why, Darnell?" he asked quietly. "I could have handled it myself." "No, you wouldn't," Darnell replied softly. "You'd give in to the blackmail, and then another and another. He would have sucked you dry and then revealed your secret anyway. I couldn't let that man ruin your life." Siobhan glanced over to Lorenzo. The confession was complete, but something still bothered her. "Minus Mr. Patrice, do you realize you just confessed to premeditated murder?" "Yes, Detective," Darnell answered calmly. "I am prepared to be punished for my actions." "Darnell Patrice, you are under arrest for the murder of Quentin Brooks," Siobhan said formally, while Lorenzo pulled out his handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." While Lorenzo read the rights and handcuffed Darnell, Siobhan watched Judge Devereaux carefully. He sat motionless, with an expression of shock and grief on his face. "Judge Devereaux," she said quietly, "we will need to talk again in detail about your role in all of this. For now, you are free to go, but do not leave the city." Leroy nodded slowly without raising his eyes. When Darnell was led away, Siobhan was alone with the judge. "You really didn't know what he was planning?" she asked. "I swear I didn't," Leroy answered, finally looking up. "I would never have approved of murder no matter how desperate my situation. But it was my fault for dragging him into it. I told him about the blackmail, about my fears. He was always too protective, too loyal. He loved you," Siobhan said simply. "Yes," the judge smiled sadly, "and I was too concerned with preserving my position, my reputation, to fully appreciate it." "What will you do now?" "I will resign," Leroy said firmly. "Whether or not I'm charged with complicity, I can't continue to pass judgment on others when my own life is built on lies." Siobhan nodded and stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "Detective," the judge called out to her when she was already at the door. "Do you think I'll ever be able to forgive myself for what happened?" "I don't know," Siobhan answered honestly. "But maybe you should start by accepting who you really are." 2 weeks later, the court sentenced Darnell Patrice to 25 years in prison for first-degree murder with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Judge Leroy Devereaux resigned as promised, but he was not charged with accessory after the fact there was insufficient evidence of his direct involvement in the murder. Lakeisha Moses, Quentin's sister, attended every session of the trial, silently observing the proceedings. When the verdict came down, she approached Detective Temple at the courthouse exit. "Thank you," she said. Quentin wasn't a good man, I know that, but he didn't deserve to die like this. No one does, Siobhan replied. I'm sorry we couldn't have prevented it. You did what you could, Lakeisha smiled weakly. At least now I know the truth. That evening, Siobhan sat on the porch of her house, looking out at the sunset and reflecting on the case that had ended. 3 lives had been ruined because of the secret that Judge Devereaux had tried so desperately to keep hidden. She thought about the price people pay for their secrets, not only those who keep them, but those around them who inevitably find themselves caught up in a web of lies and fear. Perhaps the real tragedy was not the murder itself, but the society that forced a man like Leroy Devereaux to hide his true identity, to live in constant fear of exposure. What if he didn't have to hide? What if he could have been open and honest from the start? Perhaps then Quentin Brooks would still be alive and Darnell Patrice would still be free. But Siobhan was a realist. She knew that the world changed slowly, and that in places like Austin, Texas, even in the 21st century, some truths still had to be hidden. And as long as that was the case, people would continue to pay an unimaginable price for their secrets. The phone in her pocket vibrated. New case, new secrets, new victims. Detective Siobhan Temple finished her coffee, stood up, and walked back inside. The job never ended,